So this discussion is called Policing and Coronavirus. I should say, guys, we did have Chris Williamson, the former MP, was going to join us for this, but I don't know if he's been headlocked or what, but he's been locked down. We haven't been able to get hold of him. And Emily, I'm sure you'd be all right to cope without that, Emily. But what we do have, and we're blessed to have, is we have Emily Apple from Canary and involved in NetPol, as I understand. NetPol is an organisation. Well, I'll let NetPol speak for themselves in a minute, because we're blessed with Kevin here as well from NetPol, Kev Blowe. And me and Kev haven't met in person, Fiona, but we're about to meet him in person.
Hi, Kev.
And we also have Attiq Malik, who is one of our local soldiers for civil rights, in terms of is a civil rights solicitor.
Okay.
And focusing particularly, I've done a lot of work with Attiq on the prevent strategy, the government's prevent strategy, which a lot of people think is like a police state mechanism in itself. So where's Rob? I'm just about to open up the meeting room. Could we ask Emily? Can you hear me, Emily?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Brilliant.
Right. So Emily, I'm going to hand over to you, mate, because we've not got Chris, right? But he might pop in during. But as deal with it like we haven't got him for now. So there's you, there's Attiq, and there's Kevin. And feel free to bring us in at any time you like.
Brilliant. Feel free to jump in at any time you want. So we're going to host this as a round table. So it's going to be more like a sort of chat between us all about the new powers regarding coronavirus, what our rights are under the new legislation, what context we put this into in terms of existing policing and how policing normally works, the lessons we can learn from it, and look into the future, what this act means, when will these powers end, and how do we resist and protect our civil liberties whilst we're in lockdown. So I was going to start with just looking at the new police powers and what powers the police actually have now with the Coronavirus Act. And Attiq, I don't know whether you wanted to start on that, if you're happy to start on that.
Yeah, I can start on that. With the powers that have come in, it's actually two pieces of legislation that have come in, not one. And everyone's a little bit confused on where they stand with it all. One is the Coronavirus Act, and then you've also got the public health regulations that have come in, and they both work in tangent with each other. And I think the biggest problem the police have had, and which infringes on our human rights, is that people who are supposed to be enforcing this don't understand the law themselves. And you've got a situation, for example, where right now, the Attorney General himself has confirmed that the vast majority of people prosecuted for COVID-related offences in this country have been not only prosecuted incorrectly, but prosecuted in the absence of any legal advice or any representation. And so what you've got is a start where the people who are enforcing this have no idea what they're doing. And then that's not the end of the human rights breaches, that's the start, because then these people who are being subjected to these draconian measures, which have for the first time ever been implemented in any peacetime, even in time of war, you could argue in some ways some of these measures are just so extreme in terms of the restraint on civil liberties. And then that's the start of the breaches, because if people aren't getting access to legal advice and proper representation, then even at court you've got issues. I mean, I'll give you one example, because I'm obviously on various forums with lawyers and all the rest of it. And something that came out last week was at Westminster Magistrates Court. Someone, you've got the requirement to not come out of your house. Yes, you can only leave for reasonable excuse. What happens if you're homeless? So clearly the legislation does not apply to people who are homeless because you have no place of abode. And there was a person brought to Westminster Magistrates Court, I think last week or the week before, who's actually homeless. And the police wanted to prosecute them. And the judge said, what are you doing? Are you sure this applies? Because the provisions do not apply to the homeless. They left the courtroom, went to get advice from the senior CPS lawyers, came back and stuck to their guns and said, yes, we are. And it was absolutely ridiculous, you know. And one of the biggest messages out there that I would say is this, just to sort of sum it up a little bit. One, the list of reasons to leave your house is not an exhaustive list under the regulation. It's a non-exhaustive list. What that means then, if you have a reason which is not on that list, such as getting supplies or whatever, it doesn't automatically mean you're foul of the law. As long as your reason for leaving is a reasonable excuse. You know, there could be 101 reasons why you have to leave your house. So that's one thing the police don't understand. They keep looking at this list thinking it's an exhaustive list, when it's actually a non-exhaustive list. The other thing is, there is no power of stop and account. So this is quite important. So if a police officer stops someone on the street, we've already had issues with stop and search, and we know all the stats about, you know, how discriminatory that is. In this one, whilst they have to ensure that people have only come out of their houses for a reasonable excuse reason, how do they then figure out if the person is actually out for reasonable excuse? Because within that legislation, there's no power for them to question. There's no requirement on you to account. So if I just stood there and said no comment, I went quiet, how does that trigger for them a power without corroborating evidence that I've come out without reasonable excuse? Because the burden of proof is on them to prove that I've come out without a reasonable excuse, not for me to prove my innocence. But again, they don't understand this. And another factor is some of the powers that there are only apply to people. And if you just bear with me a second, I want to use the right wording here. Just give me 1 second. And it only applies to people who are, here's the wording, potentially infectious persons. If you're not a potentially infectious person, a lot of the legislation doesn't even apply to you. Now, nobody's carrying a test in their pocket. Nobody's got testing equipment to test people on the street to see the potentially infectious persons. So how are all of these people being, you know, arrested and prosecuted and all the rest of it? It's absolutely ridiculous.
And we've already had the findings that every single person that they tried to prosecute or arrested for being an infectious person was unlawful.
Completely unlawful. Completely unlawful.
So Kevin, maybe I'll pick that up with you, because you've been working on monitoring what's been going on with this legislation with the Undercover Research Group. And I know, for example, we've had these 14,000 fines that have been issued. And as Attiq said, there has to be a lot of doubt about whether these fines were issued legally. So, you know, what's your experience in monitoring this and how it's being implemented?
Sure. Well, I mean, I want to start off by saying that having been involved in NetPol since it started in 2009 and having been involved in monitoring police locally in East London since the early 90s, I quite often find it surprising that anybody is in any way shocked that this is the reaction to a piece of legislation that was introduced with almost no scrutiny, with enormous amounts of powers. Exactly. And then was implemented without any of us being able to witness or protest or record what was going on in many cases, because we're all stuck at home. Yeah. We have been trying to document the various stories from around the country right at the very beginning, because we kind of anticipated where this was going to go. We started a blog called Policing the Corona State, which is I don't know what we expected at the beginning, but we're now on the 39th entry in that diary, in this seemingly never-ending stuck indoors and not knowing what's going on. And much of that has been recording the testimony that we get from people around the country, looking at local newspapers and what the reporting is happening there, because that has been, by and large, the best place to be able to find this information. And everything that Attiq has said is true. I mean, these are the stories that are emerging. There are the implementing of these powers has invariably been used in an arbitrary and unfair manner. We now know that the prosecutions that have taken place have uniformly been unlawful, so far at least from the review. And we also know that, I think we've got a reasonable expectation that aside from the kind of the stories that have got out there about the ludicrous examples of the things that the police have done, that by and large it's the things that aren't being reported, which is the massive increase in the use of stop and search, for instance. We know that has happened in London in the space of between March and April. The numbers of stops and searches went up by 22%.
Do we know what justification they're given for those increased stop and searches at the time?
They were saying that there was the increase in searches was for because they were cracking down on drug use. Which, given they're in the middle of a health emergency, is somewhat ironic. I think you'll agree. And that's actually kind of important, because what people forget is that the laws that Attiq talked about, the Coronavirus Act, the health regulations, were introduced not because there was some sort of crime wave that needed to be tackled. It was because they were about protecting public health. They were about reducing the spread of a disease. And yet the police's response to this has been not to treat this as a public health issue, but to treat it as a public order issue, to go out there and basically crack down on the public, right? So in the first week of the lockdown, we saw this massive number of fines that were issued by particular forces. And that was about going out and sending a message. And much of that is to do with the particular culture of some of the forces that were the most kind of robust in going out and doing that. So Lancashire were, they were issuing fines like confetti in the first week. All the people that I worked with over the last 5 years from Lancashire who've experienced policing in their opposition to the onshore oil and gas industry and fracking will know exactly the police's idea in that area of going hard, crack a few heads. That will send a message to them. I mean, that's what they do, right? And so, I mean, I think the starting point for this discussion is to also, in terms, the reason why these laws were introduced was supposedly to protect us. But and the reason why the guidance was issued, it was supposed to be guidance for us, to tell us what it is that we need to do. And the way it's been interpreted is these are a set of instructions for the police to use as a checklist to decide whether they're going to issue fines or not. And it's completely about face, but it's because that's the way the police approach everything. They approach it on the basis of essentially we're not really trusting us as citizens to do what we're told.
Absolutely. But isn't it also, I mean, the other thing that's occurred to me throughout this is there's been a lot of commentary of, oh, the police have got new laws, they're adjusting to how to use them. But I think anyone who's had any dealings with the police know this is how they operate the majority of the time. Anyone who's ever been to a protest knows that the police will make the law up as they go along. So I'm sort of wondering whether you think there's any difference in how the police are acting with this, because I'm hearing a lot of excuses for the way that the police are acting, but my sense is actually it's kind of business as usual, but with some more powers tagged on that they can use.
Well, to answer that question, I think there are elements of it being business as usual, but there's no question that this is an exceptional time, right? And the irony, of course, is that it seems like an age ago now, but if you go right back to the very beginning when we were suddenly forced into our homes, if you remember at the time, it wasn't because the government told us that we needed to do this, right? The government was dragged kicking and screaming into taking action because of public opinion, because people said we're genuinely worried about our family and our friends. And at the time, Boris Johnson was far more concerned about keeping open the markets and supporting business, and was talking about this kind of idea that that there was an inalienable right to go to the pub, and that people wouldn't comply with these lockdown regulations. Of course, what they're saying now is that people are refusing. They're upset now because people are refusing to go back to work. But I think with the police, the starting point was, as I said, is okay. We've been given some new powers. We don't really know how exactly how we're going to use these, but we also know that there's no scrutiny. And if you look at probably every piece of major public order legislation that's been introduced in the last 30 years, you've seen that pattern as well. So I'll give you an example. Late 90s, a piece of legislation was introduced to deal with stalking. A genuine problem, women being stalked by former boyfriends, that sort of thing, right? That protection of harassment legislation and the stalking legislation has been consistently used to attempt to smother and crack down on people's rights to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly in a way that the politicians who created that legislation at the time never intended at all. So it may well be that when the Coronavirus Act was being framed and when decisions were being made about what needs to be included within it, the people who drafted it thought, well, we need this. This is a way of making sure that we protect the public and stop the spread of the disease. The police looked at it and thought, well, you know what? This public can't be trusted. We're going to have to use this to go around and essentially, metaphorically, crack a few heads. What's been really fascinating is, of course, that the backlash has not been from the usual suspects. So it's not just groups like NetPol. Increasingly, columnists in the Daily Mail and places like that are both endorsing some of the things that we're saying, which is weird, following our social media, which is really weird, and emailing me and asking me for comment, which is no comment, obviously. But yeah, it's a strange alliances, I guess.
Isn't it weird? Glenn?
Yeah, what a weird thing. Yeah, I was going to ask you that, Kev. I was going to ask you and Attiq and you, Emily, as well. By the way, I just had a message from Laurie Love, who's supposed to be joining us. Yeah, he's going to try and join us, but just having a few issues, see whether he can get in.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, but I just wanted to ask that, Kev. So that's been a strange thing about all this, is that it's generally, there's a left and the right, and in this period, like, left-wingers, staunch left-wingers I know are sort of like, bind us tighter is the cry, do you know what I mean? It's a weird scenario where people who are generally defenders of rights and freedoms are saying, look, temporarily take them away from us in big style. And I get it, I do get it. I get the the concern for the other. That's why we've shut down here, isn't it? It's because for concern for the other, we don't want to spread this virus to people who are far more vulnerable than we do.
That's right. And
I feel vexed to the core that the government didn't do that, and therefore we've been kind of forced into a lockdown in a way. But the right wingers seem to be the ones, and not just the dollar heads. I think the dollar heads, obviously they want to open money first before people's standard for them. But there's some columnists on the right wing, Hitchens and people like that, who have been made. What do you think, Kev? Do you think that's a sign of the times, or what, mate?
I mean, I don't think there's always been a strand of the right which has been broadly libertarian and which has rejected the state, but it's always been in order to be able to protect something else. If it's not the public, it's always to protect the market, and that's an entirely different set of impulses there, right? So, but I mean, ultimately, it's entirely possible to be able to say, we think that there needs to be a shutdown of the economy, and that people need to take measures in order to be able to protect their loved ones and their community in the short term, and also be able to say, but that doesn't mean that we need the police going round and pushing people out of parks and arresting people for completely ridiculous reasons, right? Those two things are entirely separate. And I guess the way you can approach this to say is, well, what would have been the alternative? Because right at the very beginning, there were choices. You didn't have to go down the route of introducing, wildly draconian powers. There was, I think, very clearly massive public support for taking some form of action. Including ultimately public support for the lockdown measures that were for the guidance that was given, and it would have been possible to have taken another approach. if you think back to the end of March, what people overwhelmingly felt was a sense of fear, right? People were worried about what the future was going to hold, and this was an opportunity to be able to build some form of consensus, build some form of general kind of community sense of people coming together. And you saw that from that massive explosion of people leaping forward and wanting to be involved in mutual aid groups at the beginning. And we also know that in previous pandemics, one of the crucial things is about building trust, right? You look at the biggest pandemic there's been, it's not this one, it's the HIV and AIDS pandemic over the sport space of 30 years. And it was going out and because there was no attempt to try and challenge the kind of misinformation and prejudice that was there at the time, it led to people dying. So there was choices definitely that were there, having gone down the route of using a fairly draconian at times, and I think under the radar, probably far more draconian, the stories that are not being told. I think the big difference is that unlike this time last year, this was affecting, let's be absolutely blunt, white middle class people, and not people in working class and black communities in urban areas around the country, right? And because of that, suddenly people sat up and went, how dare they be doing it to us, And I think that's definitely, I don't know what Attiq thinks, but I think that's definitely what's been fueling this.
Definitely. I think I can't remember who made the point about stop and search being a real issue now. So is it along the usual lines where young black males are being stopped more compared to their counterparts? Or
I think it's not only is it along the usual lines, it's increased fourfold apparently. In my personal opinion, from dealing with the police, this is my opinion. I think what's happened is everyone's locked down. Police are driving around with nothing to do. And so if they see a few people walking around, say, yeah, let's stop a searching. We've got nothing better to do right now. And the biases have kicked in, and we haven't got the full stats yet, but from the echoes that we're having, I don't see a change in pattern of the type of people they're stopping. And it's increased fourfold. And it's funny that Cressida Dick, the Met Police Commissioner, was on it straight away defending it. And all of her justifications flew in the face of all the criticisms, which are backed up by stats over all the years. It's all political, isn't it? They know they're in the wrong. So they're using that strategy of let us get there first before anybody else does to justify our position. And that's what they've been doing.
Which frightens me, actually, because we're in this state of emergency, which is kind of solidifying, it's kind of justifying certain behaviours. And that actually frightens me,
What do you mean? You mean like police behaviours on? So
police behaviour now, regardless, is going to kind of be more accepted, as it were, because we've all got to
consenting to it.
People are going to be more understanding because we're all on lockdown and we're all trying to be safe. So certain behaviours from the police are going to be more accepted.
Yeah.
And the fact that you told me that this potentially could go on and for the next 2 years.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
I reviewed that, by the way, about the 2-year limit. And it appears that in some of the guidance, there actually isn't a limit for how long it can go on for. They've got a 21-day reviewing process. But the way they've drafted it all, it could go on for beyond 2 years. And we have to remember how they've brought legislation in the past, sneaked it in for different reasons, and then it's used for different reasons. Like, for example, you have RIPA, which is the Regulation of Investigation Powers Act. And that was brought in under the guise of terror legislation, where if you didn't give a PIN number, for example, to your mobile, it became a criminal offence. And recently, in the last few years, we've seen that same legislation used by local authorities prosecuting benefit fraud, and look at where it started. And with stop and search, the other concern that a lot of the people that campaign against prevent, etc., have is this. At the airports, you've got the Schedule 7 stops happening, and it's hard to challenge them because to do a Schedule 7 stop, the police do not have to show reasonable grounds of suspicion for anything. There's no requirement in the law for that. At the moment, for stop and search, that requirement is still there. There has to be a reasonable suspicion requirement. Because Schedule 7 stop detention has gone unchallenged on the reasonable suspicion requirement element, the Metropolitan Police, towards the end of last year, have lobbied the government to also remove the reasonable suspicion requirement from stop and search. So that little mechanism that is supposed to make stop and search safer, and it's already discriminatory, as we know, is being lobbied to be taken away. So my prediction is after COVID, they're going to use all of these successes to take away the reasonable suspicion backstop, making the stop and search processes a free-for-all.
Oh, gosh.
Maybe
Yeah.
I think we can come on a little bit to talking about the future, but I think if we could just focus a little bit on, I want to just answer that point you raised about whether this is disproportionate or not. So the National Police Chiefs Council, which is kind of the body that brings together all the senior officers, did finally produce some statistics on this, and they're a little bit unhelpful, but what they show is that you're about twice as likely to be stopped and searched if you're black than if you're white at the moment, to be fined, I should say, to be fined under the coronavirus health regulations, and it's something like 4 times more likely if you're Asian. And what they've tried to do is they've tried to say, well, it's broadly within the population, the breakdown of the population of the country. It's not broadly at all, right? It's also misleading because these are national figures, and as we all know, Asian, Black British populations, they don't live uniformly across the country. They're Black British half the Black British population is in London, but it's also in Bristol and in Birmingham and other places, right? So what we really need to know is what is the number of fines and the increases in stop and search in those places, in cities like Birmingham and Leeds and Sheffield and Bristol and wherever it might be, but also in places in police forces like Dorset. Dorset has been really kind of out there and aggressive about demanding that people stay out of its county. It has, in terms of the size of the population, issued a really significant number of fines, which seems weird because it's not like a gritty urban area, Dorset, let's face it, right? But one of the interesting things about Dorset also has the highest number of disproportionality in terms of its stop and search. So you're 25 times more likely per 100,000 of the population to be stopped and searched in Dorset if you're black than if you're white. And that's before any of this started, right? So we need to know what's happening in those places. The big problem is it's really hard to find out, partly because the police are saying, oh, well, the coronavirus means that we overstretch, so we can't do freedom of information requests. We can't publish information in the way that we usually do. The only reason we know about the massive increase in the use of stop and search in London is that they've managed to release the figures, right? That itself is unusual. Manchester, which is an area where we'd really like to know what's going on, because some of the worst cases that have come forward, including video of people being tasered when they've gone to drop off stuff to their mum. I don't know whether you may have seen some of this on social media. Flatly refuses to give out any information at all. They haven't published any stop and search data since July last year. So how are we supposed to know what's going on? We can only speculate. I think Attiq's right. There is definitely, and sort of the anecdotal information that we're getting and the people that ring me up and say, is this right? Can the police do this? Overwhelmingly are young black men, particularly in London, most of whom have been stopped and searched dozens of times before, but wanting clarification of how the coronavirus regulations have changed things. And of course, by and large, they haven't. As Attiq said, there's no additional stop and search power. And most of the regulations relate specifically to people who are sick. So it's just been, and I completely endorse the idea that police have had rather too much time on their hands and have been using some of that time to essentially pick on individuals. But I also want to emphasise this: don't think for 1 second that started on the 23rd of March. That has been going on for decades. I remember doing stop and search workshops in East London in the early 90s where this was happening. So in some ways, we are seeing a continuation of the way things have always been.
And that was actually going to be one of my other questions to sort of talk about, is while we are seeing the use of these laws and stop and search being used very disproportionately, there's still a section of white middle class society who are being stopped by the police in a way that they haven't been before. And whether that will lead to more empathy for what has been going on forever and open their eyes to it a bit more, or whether it will just get compartmentalized and it will be, oh, well, this was because of this, and, you know, this is totally separate, and the institutional racism in the police is totally separate, or whether it will help to open up that debate in the future, and people who before wouldn't have listened or wouldn't have understood what it was like even just to be stopped by the police once start to get more of an understanding, and whether that's something we can build on in the future or not.
That's a tough question.
Sorry.
I'll tell you why I think it's a tough question, because I think that out there in the sort of the lockdown world, it's not all people fuming at the police and mutual aid and solidarity. One of the things that is a big problem, has been a big problem since all this started, is that there have been legions of people who've been more than willing to ring up and condemn their neighbours for alleged infringements of the lockdown regulations, to the extent that some police forces have actually said, "Will you stop ringing us?" So there is a certain level of curtain twitching going on in towns all over the place.
Rank.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is that in a number of the mutual aid groups that exist up and down the country, there has been a constant battle from people within them to try and stop people in those groups from doing exactly the same thing, right? From wanting to report people to the police. And people having to make the argument that actually we're here to provide support for people. We're not here to criminalise them. And I think that's important, because transformations in the way that people behave don't happen overnight. They don't happen overnight. There is a layer of people who have some degree of faith that the reason why the police are involved in this is essentially to keep people safe. Now, I don't agree with that at all. I think people keep people safe. And actually, in many cases, the police's role has been disruptive, and in many cases has made things worse, in particular because of the apparent refusal to actually embrace the social distancing regulations themselves when they're stopping people and issuing fines. But I think there is some people who will have learned from this, and I think that it's really down to us to be able to encourage some degree of thinking and some degree of education about what we've actually learned from this entire experience. You know, this is not just a crisis in terms of society, but it's also an opportunity for us to be able to draw some conclusions about you know, what does this mean in terms of the way that we organise things in the future. But I think a slightly kind of rose-tinted and optimistic view that somehow, because a bunch of people have been kicked out of the park for doing yoga, somehow means that we're going to be sympathetic towards people who are routinely stopped and searched is too much belief.
It's not a bit of yoga then, Kev, you know what I mean? Yoga, good for you, mate, you know what I mean? Can I ask a question, Emily?
Yeah, you can. Oh, can I just say something first? Because I meant to say this before. If you have got any questions, if you're watching this on the live event and you've got any questions for any of the panelists about the issues here, you can leave a comment in the feed and they will hopefully be messaged to us by the lovely John. Right,
Lovely
carry
John.
on.
I remember John at Beautiful Days. Yeah.
We did.
Anyway, what I was going to ask Kevin and Attiq and everybody, Fiona, Emily, this whole stuff, yeah. I mean, look, to me, you can say before it even started, black people will be targeted more by the police than anybody else, because that's standard. That's an everyday thing. And when the police get more powers, expect more black people to be harassed, if you like. You know, that to me just goes without saying. It's kind of it's an unwritten truth.
And
if you like.
probably one of the reasons why my son goes to uni in London. He left, so he was living in London, and early March he was back home.
For what? Because
the whole stop and search.
You know what I mean?
And he knew that it was just going to intensify.
Exactly. And if you to be black and not know that, right? And that's what I mean. We can have these discussions about what the stats saying and all of that. I'm telling you, you know, like Emily, you know, the reality on the ground is that as soon as you give police more powers, there's certain policemen out there who will be stopping you in the Yorkshire Dales with drones and all that, and exercising this sort of Hitlerian sort of authority because they love it. You know what I mean? But this is what troubles me, right? And this is for you, Kevin, and Attiq as well, to come back to, if you could, please. What troubles me is all of these powers, which we see are being abused, and they will be, and overstretched. That would be less of a concern to me if they were 30-day renewable. Yeah, like all emergency powers in all other countries, as far as I understand, and particularly in this country, it's always been 30-day renewable powers. So you have to go back to Parliament and say, do we still need these? Because they're emergency powers by their very nature. But the fact that these have been brought in for 2 years, and Labour seem to think that an achievement is to have them reviewed every 6 months. Well, 6 months is enough time to establish a new normality. That's what worries me. And what I wanted to ask you, Kev and Attiq, and that is, why do you think the government, this government, chose not only to disregard Civil Contingency Acts laws, which are already in place and would have given them all the powers they need to do lockdown, but with a 30-day renewal, rejected that and said, no, we want to go for a 2-year, right? And bypass the Civil Contingency Act. And at the same time, you notice that the app which they want to use to track everybody, this government is going for a more severe version in terms of privacy intrusion than any other government in the world. What the fuck? I mean, what's going on here? You know, what is it with Britain that, you know what I mean, that we want more, far more intrusive than everybody else, even than Donald Trump? You know what I mean? What is that? What do you think that is, Kevin, Attiq, Emily, Fiona? What do you think that is?
Somebody go first.
I mean, my position is quite simply that it's always been the establishment's position to control the populace as much as possible and pushing towards a police state. And the fact that these safeguards are not in place and the review process is pushed back the way it has, I would say be prepared for them to use this opportunity through the back door to bring in more control measures, to weaken safeguards and other pieces of legislation, and for some of the current changes to remain in some shape or form. It is simply another opportunity for them to improve their police state control of the populace.
I mean, imagine in 6 months' time, Attiq, I can see it now. I can see headlines saying terrorists are developing a COVID bomb sort of thing. Do you know what I mean? So we need to retain these powers. Do you see what I mean? And as soon as you say that, people will willingly,
without question,
grant them the powers. You know, this is what's so frightening about it. You know,
to keep people safe.
Safety. I mean, it's always the age-old thing, and it's like safety versus liberty. You know, security and liberty, and what's the trade-off? You know, between how safe do you want to be? But I mean, just it's just a strange thing to me that, well, not strange, being British, but the British government, this one particularly, are far more. You know what I mean?
Well, they're going for it, right?
They're going for it, man.
This 2-year thing is, I wasn't aware of it, and I'm frightened. I'm actually frightened.
There's no need for 2 years, Attiq. Can you see any reason for needing 2 years, Attiq?
that my understanding is that it was 2 years. And again, like I said, on my most recent review, because the legislation keeps changing, every 21 days they're tweaking it. And some of the tweaks aren't coming out. And I might have read it wrong, but my most recent review of it would seem to imply that there is no limit until they change it. So it might be more than 2 years. It could be, and on top of that, the only review they've got at the moment that I can see is a 21-day review. So every 21 days, the review should review the position and provide an update of where are we now, do we still need it? But the backstop of 2 years either it's disappeared or is only applying to some of the legislation and not all of it.
Sorry, so who's reviewing the position? Who is it that's actually reviewing?
Parliament is supposed to review the position every 21 days and then give an update to everybody on where we are.
They're not even meeting, are they, Parliament? They're all zoomed up at home and listening to Rachel Reeves chat breeze, as far as I can see.
let me give you my view on this, because
sorry, Kev.
That's right. I think you just, first of all, let me just say that I don't think it's unique to this government. In all honesty, I would say possibly the worst government, the most draconian powers, both policing and security, the last 30 years has been the Blair government, and there certainly were far more terrorism legislation.
British still, though, Kev. British still.
So there's definitely been, but I mean, there's always been an incentive within Britain to want to use very tough powers, and the approach for both the policing and the state doesn't tend to be the sort of similar approach that you might get in parts of, say somewhere like France, right, where the police's reaction to most things is to line a load of officers up across the middle of the street and start tear gassing people. Right. There is a sense that it's far more important to be able to bring people along, or at least bring most of the people along, so that you're able to implement the laws against the minority of people that you actually want to crack down on, whether that be black and working class communities, whether that be protesters, whoever that might be at a particular moment, right? And so when the police come up with this constant mantra about policing by consent, that's what they mean. It's not that we're acting on the basis of your consent. It's that we're gonna push to get you on side for the increasingly aggressive response that we try and enact. And you can see this in at a policy level. You can see this in the reaction of the government towards the next step. So you're quite right. They've started talking far more about biosecurity. They brought somebody in from the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, which is the information gathering centre for counter-terrorism, to lead up the response to this COVID alert system that they've introduced, this 1 to 5 alert system, and it throws up many issues about what the response overall from the government and the police will be. And I think most of it will be directed towards issues around identifying perceived threats, particularly perceived threats to any attempt to try and get people back to work, and there to be a re-emergence of a second wave of infections that leads to another lockdown. Certainly from the beginning, we've said that there is the one element of the health regulations, which is about the powers of the police to be able to detain somebody and take them away for testing, was not likely to be used that dramatically at the beginning. And it's far more about imposing the lockdown. It's much more about restricting people's movement. But let's just kind of cast a mind forward to, say, I don't know, to September. More and more things have opened. People are beginning to feel that maybe they're over the hurdle and that maybe things might start to go back to normal, whatever the hell normal has become to mean at that stage. The same prejudices, misinformation and fear that I think has driven people in very large numbers to ring up and report their neighbours to the police, to announce their neighbours to the police for alleged infringements of the coronavirus movement restrictions, will be our concern is will be used to ring up the police and say, I think so and so has gotten it, is infected and hasn't reported it, hasn't done anything about it. And the obvious people at the greatest risk of that of that particular threat being one that's identified as being a priority by the people that are organising this are, well, who? Well, it's people from, it's communities, I should say, where there's a large number of frontline workers, where there's a significant number of people who work in security or shop work or work in the National Health Service. And I mean, on top of that, there's been a massive increase in hate crime against the Chinese community over the last month and a half. So, I mean, I think there's a very large expectation that they would also be a target. In other words, we're back to the same thing. We're back to trying to find somebody that we can blame. And as I said, 20 minutes ago, trying to find somebody to blame in the midst of a pandemic and increasing the level of mistrust and misinformation is dangerous, because it means that people think, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to try and get treatment in case there's a negative reaction, in case I get fired. There's lots of reasons why people genuinely will fear the response of the police and the state in those circumstances. And we know this because that's exactly what happened with HIV and AIDS. So, getting out the crystal ball and trying to work out where we go next. I mean, I think that's the big battle for later in this year. It's not that it's inevitable. Nothing so far has been inevitable. And actually, one of the really real positives about this is that the police went in really hard with their lockdown measures and faced a massive backlash against that, and have been forced to rein back much of that. Although, as I said, I still think it's probably going on under the radar. But the more public, they've stopped crowing about it. They stopped putting it up on social media. We went in the park and cleared everybody out because they know it's embarrassing now. They've lost the consent, in other words. They've lost the ability to be able to carry people with them. And then that's been down to people publicising it, to be honest. And we're going to have to do the same at every step of the way. Because, as we all know, this battle is going to be the battle to try and protect people from being criminalised as a result of what should be about protecting people from a disease is going on at least for the next 2 years.
No, absolutely. I want to come on to talk about some of that future stuff as well in a second. And I have a question as well. But first, I just wanted to make a point about the British state and how the British state operates in terms of legislation. And as both Attiq and Kevin were saying, it isn't just about this. If you look back, the only piece of legislation, main piece of legislation that got through the Brexit lock Parliament was another counter-terrorism bill that brought in more repressive powers and more restrictions on freedom of speech in terms of widening the definitions that were previously in the Terrorism Act. And before the virus hit, we had, for example, the extremism bill that was never published, that was set to provide a whole new raft of powers for the police over this term extremism, which isn't defined in law, that no one has been able to define ever. Theresa May, when she was Home Secretary, she couldn't define it. And they've had various working definitions, but it is not defined. And so we have all this terrorism legislation. Then they wanted to bring in this extremism legislation. And actually, if you look at what's happened with this law in the context of all these other laws that we've got and that were being proposed, it makes sense. It is how the British state operates in terms of crushing things, in terms of imposing their agenda. And it's not that surprising. It's disturbing and it needs to be resisted, but I don't think it's difficult to compartmentalize it and see it as something other than part of a pattern in the way that the state has behaved and does behave. Because we were just talking about Parliament, I'm going to read this question now because it's relevant to the discussion we were having before about Parliament. So I've had a question come in from Avril, who says, do you think that Parliament is no longer meeting online is intentional to prevent scrutiny from opposition MPs to these new powers for the police being reviewed? And if so, why?
That's. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, somebody else want to have a go at it? Because
I will.
Go for it, Glenn.
Because it's Babylon, isn't it? We live in Babylon. We're the heart of. To me, this is an honest answer. Yeah? We live in. If you're British, if you're English, you are. Even if you're skint in British terms, you are in the richest 1% in the whole globe. Even if you're skint, if you're on 20 grand a year, that makes you. So what I'm saying is we're at the epicenter of the empire, right? And in these days, we live in an Anglo-American empire. That's my view of the world, is that the Anglo-American, what I call USUK, US, UK, is the dominant power. And they're the ones that are going to be chasing condensed power at any opportunity they can. That's the way I see it, right? So it's kind of Babylon Central, if you like, is UK and US, right? And so the more comfortable you are in a country, I mean, I'll give you an example. In Africa, a bung is a bung. So this man give his brother-in-law a bung, right, from the government. In Britain, they call that a non-executive directorship. They dress it up in a load of legal jargon to make a bung not a bung. It's actually a legal job where you can sit on a panel and do nothing and get your wife 80 grand. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, I hear you.
In rich countries, you can. So what I'm saying is that this is the country where those exercises into venturing into people's rights are going to be well financed, well backed, and well supported by several pressure groups. Right-wing pressure groups, you know, are abundant in this country. So my view on it is that Britain's a bit of a test bed, yeah, and what they're doing at the moment is taking advantage fully of this situation. I'm not saying, as some people, some of my mates, yeah, think that they created this virus in order to be able to bring down these restrictions on people's freedoms and abilities. I don't actually believe that. I'm not in that club, yeah, but I'm definitely in the club that says that we live amongst a bunch of opportunists who will take every possible opportunity they can, well-funded opportunity, to clamp down on people's rights. And as Liberty said, it's not me saying this, it's Liberty saying this, it's one of the biggest shifts of power between the individual and the state that they've ever seen.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's you know, we've never been here, right?
Right.
Ever, any of us.
Right.
Our parents and our grandparents, we've never been here.
I mean, I never envisaged or imagined a situation where I could be in a scenario where the government are telling me you can get an estate agent round your house if you're selling it.
Right.
But my mum can't come there.
Right.
Oh, don't forget, you can get your cleaner and nanny in as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Emily, if that's not money before love, I mean, when Boris made his speech about who can go to work and didn't even mention whether you can see your mum or not, that shows you this. I mean, we've got what you call affluenza in this country. We're far too rich, right? And we're far too comfortable to concern ourselves with that sort of thing. And that's what I think, Kev, that's what I think, Attiq, Emily, Fiona. I think that this country is the epicenter of the empire. And because they're so well funded, we're so well funded, they're going to try and make advances into our freedoms in the same way as the company directors dressed up as it's honorable. And people, unfortunately, in my view, in this country, are currently applauding that.
Right.
They're saying we want to be bound even tighter than we already are. And I think there needs to be a serious balance between real protection of safety, like me not going to see my dad who's 80 odd. And I think if I had this virus, I could probably last it out, but it might kill my dad.
Right.
So I'm, you know, because the government failed him, I have to protect him. There's a distinction between that and me not being able to go to the park with my dog more than once a day in the open air where there's no viruses. You know what I mean? So, you know, that's where I'm at. I think this country are leaders, not only in economy, but in infringement on people's rights in a sort of sneaky, dressed up, corporate looking way. What do you think of that?
Hey, Attiq, I think you're going to come in.
Yes, so yeah, I mean, with the question, I think that person's absolutely right. You cannot put anything past the way the establishment works. You know, these slight little maneuvers of, well, yes, we've got an excuse now not to convene. We need to push this through urgently. They will pull every possible trick in the book to push legislation through with as little debate or opposition as possible, wherever possible, whenever possible. It's always been the case. And I'm not surprised by what I'm seeing. So.
I mean, without necessarily disagreeing with everything that's been said, I mean, I wouldn't be a campaigner if I didn't take a more positive view about what was possible. It was possible to achieve, and to answer the question directly, which is about whether the Parliament's inability to be able to meet and meeting online in order to be able to scrutinise what's going on. I mean, I take a different view, which is you can see that as being important if you think that Parliament really does have an influence on the way that the both the government and all the corporate interests that you've talked about make decisions about the way that our economy and society run. I'm an anarchist. I don't accept that that is the case, and would argue that actually the potential driving force for change isn't necessarily our ability to be able to influence the House of Commons in order to be able to vote the right way. It's about us being able to mobilise in order to be able to apply enough pressure that they feel that they have to respond to a wave of public anger and public opinion. And I think the difficulty that we've had over the last 6-7 weeks is, of course, it's been very difficult for us to be able to articulate as collectively as the public what it is we actually want, because we've all been stuck indoors. To a certain extent, I think that's not going to change in the short term, but I really don't think that whether Parliament gets together in order to be able to scrutinise what the government is currently doing is going to make as much difference as people think it might do. Because if that was the case, parliamentary scrutiny would have stopped the decade-long persecution of Muslim communities by prevent. It would have stopped the constant labelling and categorisation of people involved in any form of political activity as being extremists, right? But that hasn't happened. The victories that have come because of the campaigners outside of Parliament, from the pressure that's been organised by the coalitions that have been built. I still think that is a far more effective use of our energy.
I agree,
than relying on some people in Parliament to. Not that, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm sure that many of them are very nice people. Well, I'm sure that some of them are very nice people. Right? I'm in regular contact with Jenny Jones, who's a member of the House of Lords, who's lovely, and is also has routinely been on the list of police so-called domestic extremists for a very long time, right? I see that as being a badge of honour for her, frankly, but I do think that those people who are potentially helpful for us within Parliament are good because they come to understand the issues that we're presenting to them, right? And I don't think it's that we have to be waiting on people to be able to do that. I think we can do that ourselves. It is clearly really frustrating that we can't do that in public, collectively, out on the streets in the way that we've done before. But that will return. We will get back to that at some point. And it's not as though, I mean, in all honesty, that there hasn't been campaigning over the last 6 weeks. I mean, there's been constant pressure on, just in terms of the area that we've been talking about. There has been campaigning to try and get all of the fines that have been issued reviewed. So they've reviewed the prosecutions, but the next step is to say those 14,000 fines that have been issued since the end of March or since mid-March need to be reviewed. Because if the prosecutions have been terrible, then you can guarantee that there is a substantial proportion of those fines have been issued essentially on the whim of the officers involved in it, and have got nothing to do with it either genuinely protecting public health or indeed any infringement of the regulations at all. It's just
Kevin,
that people don't know what their rights are, and there's nobody out there, no scrutiny out there at all.
No,
Kevin.
absolutely. Sorry, Ben.
Sorry. I just wanted to ask. I hear that. I really do. But what I'm talking about is not the misapplication of law on the ground by police officers. I'm talking about a government. And why is this government?
Why is it when we take
what's going on
one
there?
message?
Hold on, preacher. Sorry, Rob.
Lost you there for a second.
Yeah.
Sorry, Kev. What I was going to say is the broader question I was asking was about this government. You said that you don't think this government has done anything unique, but I'm questioning whether other governments have brought in 2-year legislation rather than 30-day emergency renewable legislation. And I'm sure they have, but to what degree? And that this government has a particular habit, as with the app, the health app that they're bringing out,
Right.
whereas even Orange and Apple and all them lot, their app said to be safer in privacy terms than the British NHS
I know,
app.
and isn't it something when you're kind of saying, "Oh, I'd rather have an app by Apple or Google."
Exactly,
than,
Emily. Exactly,
but,
Emily.
But we've got Serco doing it in this country, who have an appalling record anyway. And that's something I wanted to come on to. So I was about to say we've got half an hour left, so I'd like to talk about this app, and also about whether that's going to lead to any ideas of immunity passports, and whether we're finally going to see a government have ID cards through the back door. We know they've wanted ID cards for years and years and years. So in terms of how this will be enforced, but also I'd like to look to the future a bit for this last bit as well, about we sort of touched on it before, what might be coming, and also how we mobilise at the moment. Like Kev was saying, there's a lot of campaigning and organising still going on, but I think many people who are at home or under lockdown probably feel quite disempowered because the usual routes of protest and mobilisation aren't open to us. So what ideas people have for getting involved in things, or feeling that they can change things when we don't have those usual mechanisms in place.
Yeah, for that fee.
Who wants to go first?
I
think you look like you're about to unmute yourself.
I was going to say, Kevin, do you want to go first this time, and then we follow up?
Okay. So really big questions there.
Sorry, I put a lot into that, and that was more for like, you can just take one of them. That was more because we've got half an hour left of the things that we haven't covered.
I mean, let's start off with the issue about campaigning. It is, as I said, it's frustrating that people can't do the campaigning that they want to in the way that they wanted to before. But this isn't going to last forever. Let's be absolutely clear about this. And there may well be things that we learn that are beneficial, right? There are a whole load of people for whom potentially their first kind of political engagement, their collective action is being involved in mutual aid groups, right? The idea, we can't discount that. I know that it's very easy to look at everything in terms of gloom and doom, but let's be absolutely clear. There are people who are still engaged in something. It may not be the kind of big political thing. It may not be going on a march or a rally, but I don't necessarily see that as being the limits of what's important if you're a campaigner. The most important thing about being a campaigner is to organise collectively, and that is still happening. And it's still happening all over the country, in towns and cities where it's probably never happened, or hasn't happened for decades, right? So that there is definitely something there.
Absolutely. So, and just say there's the session later on today. We've got people who are involved in mutual aid groups and looking at that as means of creating alternatives and stuff. Who will be talking about that in a later session today, which would be great, because I completely agree that is one of the things that is brilliant. And is political, even if they're not calling it political, that's come out of it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
The important thing to emphasise about that is that most of the mutual aid groups are not what I would call mutual aid. So they're not really about coming together in a sort of political way in order to be able to say the state has failed to respond to this, therefore we are going to organise this ourselves, and we're going to do so at the same time as shouting about why it is that the state has failed. So it's been a lot of it has been well, charitable, I think. You know, it's been about helping people. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not criticising that at all. But there is a next step, which is for those groups to also be saying, we are doing this because the government and the state have failed to do this. And the more that happens, I think it will be a big development. I do, in terms of as we begin to come out of lockdown, if that is the growing trend, and I also think that, you know, people have had to reevaluate their position on all kinds of different things. From, you know, there's real interesting and lessons that potentially you can draw about everything from climate change to the priorities for funding the arms trade over the funding the NHS, to the way that housing is allocated, and particularly how homelessness is dealt with, right? Which has all been thrown under far greater scrutiny by the government. The government said we can't deal with this, have suddenly been forced to deal with this for the situation that we found ourselves in. And as we come out of this, people are going to be saying, well, if we could do it then, why can't we do it now? And I do think that there is a potential for people to start making those arguments more. And you are seeing that. I mean, I'm a member of the London Renters Union, which is basically on the verge of calling a rent strike, right? Which is like, it could potentially be enormous if that goes ahead. But the point is, there is still campaigning going out there. The warning, I guess, and that's why I talked about the government's approach to seeing everything to do with the pandemic as being about threats, is of course they start to see us as a threat. And we've done some work, and we've gathered signatures for an open letter. We've got a number of people to sign it. We've been pushing to get the police to finally abandon labelling of campaigners as domestic extremists. If you cast your mind back to January, before we'd even heard of the coronavirus, you will remember that there was a series of documents released by Prevent, showing that Prevent officers had included everybody from CND, Extinction Rebellion, animal rights groups to you know, various peace campaigners as being groups that officers should look out for. Overwhelmingly, those groups were involved in actions which were challenging violence rather than being anything to do with violence, which I would argue is actually something that the overwhelming majority of organisations have always done. The violence on the most protests that I've experienced has been the violence of the police. But it's certainly the case that those impulses, that kind of obsessive paranoia about trying to hunt down the extremists amongst the public, has not gone away, and so we need to be guarded against that as well. I think the really interesting development will be how on earth the police are going to implement their facial recognition technology when everybody in the population is wandering around wearing a mask.
I hadn't thought about that. That is fantastic.
Did you see the T-shirt that I'm wearing here? One day we shall all be wearing one. So, how is that going to work? So that's what I mean. There are lots of things to be worried about, but I think there is an awful lot to be optimistic about as well. It's not that we haven't been able to challenge some of this stuff before. I think it will be really interesting to see what changes this will have in terms of the government's agenda on trying to drive to, quote, get Brexit done, because they ain't getting it done by the end of this year. So let's just throw that up in the air and see what the people have got to say about that.
Brilliant. I think.
Any questions at all from anybody? That would be interesting to know.
No questions, but I mean, I can agree with a lot of what Kevin said. I mean, the bottom line is campaigning has always been a multifaceted item, hasn't it? It's not a case of simply protest being the be all and end all. I've always been an avid supporter of protests and seen their results in the past work, but it also always has to be a multi-pronged approach, and we've seen many results in campaigning, from striking of different types, boycotting of different types of techniques. And I think this isn't a permanent situation, it's a temporary situation. And the bright side of it is it gives everybody an opportunity to sit back and rethink and re-strategize and explore other avenues of campaigning, which ordinarily might have felt a bit alien to them. I mean, embracing technology even more, social media campaigning, bringing people together. I think there's a lot of positives, and it's an opportunity for us to, recoup, re-strategize, and get stronger. I don't see any negatives in it. And the other side of it is this: I've always been one of the biggest weaknesses that we have had as campaigners is the different groups. So many different groups of people doing different things and often clashing with each other. And sometimes we get into a situation where we're busy arguing with each other rather than being united. And I've always been an avid believer in this, and I've seen it in action, where whenever you have a situation where oppression is increased, the unity between the oppressed increases too. And I've seen that so much, particularly in our BAME communities, that our position now from a lot of, and if you look to a lot of BAME campaigners, they will say the same thing, is that if it's oppression that brings us together, then bring it on, because if it's the unity that makes us stronger and makes us campaign better, not just acting as individuals. So we're not scared, we're ready. We've been through the 80s, we used to be racist on the street. They want to come back, we're ready. When there's nothing we're scared of.
Go on, Attiq.
Yes.
Go on, Attiq.
Yeah.
Go on.
I can't
That's
really-
the spirit.
I can't even add to that because that just sums it all up.
Can I add to it, Attiq?
Go on, Glenn.
Go on, Glenn.
Of course.
Big up, Attiq. That's what I'm saying. I was just
Can I
going
just say something?
to throw. Sorry, preacher.
on, Preacher.
You in there?
Yeah, please. Can I just say, Attiq, could you just, because I think the cameras and that went down and we did not catch the last 5 minutes of what you said there.
Well, he only spoke for free.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. So
No pressure, mate. Off you go.
yeah, what I said in summary was that the biggest problem we have in campaigning often is the differences between different people, different schools of thought, different ways of thinking. And our biggest power is unity. And what we've seen in action all over the world is whenever you increase oppression, it increases unity amongst those that are oppressed. And so from that perspective, we're not scared by the increase in oppression, and actually we embrace it because it only makes us stronger and more fired up to come together and fight it.
And I want to coming back to what I was going to say was exactly that. I think I was going to endorse that. I don't want to give the impression, Kevin, that I was saying that we're in a losing battle. I think we're in a winning battle, but I think the sirens are being sounded now. My civil rights antenna went up 100-fold when all this happened. So and I agree with Attiq there. I think that the more oppressed, there's Lyndon Kwesi Johnson came along once. He said, "All that oppression can do is bring passion to the heights of eruption," and that's what threatens to happen here. Right. So I'm not dismayed. I think that the only reason the government have been able to achieve a civil rights lockdown, because that's what it is, right, is because the people consent to it, because we consent to it.
Well, we didn't have a choice, Glenn.
Well, if we believe that our elderly loved ones and vulnerable are,
we haven't had a choice in any of this,
in
right?
danger, then you're going to do it. Yeah,
being told what to do. We had no input into the decisions that are being made.
But people are still
So we're being told, right? Our MPs are not reaching out to any groups asking for any inputs.
Yeah.
So literally, we sit there every night for these updates, and we're just absorbing it, but we're not actually being asked. But do you agree with
well,
this?
I think maybe then now it's
when have we ever been asked? When have we ever asked us this?
You're right. And for me personally, right, all of this lockdown has just highlighted that we literally,
yeah, I agree with that completely.
Literally, they've got us by our short on
No, but I want to contest that a little bit, because this is the point I was trying to make, is that look, imagine a different scenario, right? So today I don't go and see my dad, right? My dad, I love my dad, right? But I don't go and see him personally because I'm fearful that the government have left him vulnerable to this virus.
Because they've told you.
They didn't. No, because I've seen it. There's 17 people in our local care home who have died in 1 month.
Right.
So that ain't me watching YouTube or Google. That's our own experience locally, yeah?
Right.
And because of that, I am vexed with this government for allowing, especially after Operation Cygnus, when they were warned, they did a drill and they were told that you don't have the safety, PPE in place.
I'm so glad that you brought up Cygnus.
No, but that's what I'm saying.
I know it doesn't necessarily fall into what we're talking about now, but for
it
me,
does, doesn't it?
This is, I've been banging on about this 2016 Operation Cygnus, which incidentally cost millions of pounds.
And pre-warned them.
And number one, I'm not that politically aware, right? But I wasn't aware that this thing actually happened, right? But it happened.
Do you know what, Fiona? What made it worse was that when the report found what it found, the government covered the report up.
But was you aware of it 3 years ago or 4 years ago?
No, I was aware of it 1 year ago.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
But even then, you couldn't find the content. And my point being that when this government were aware of those kind of things happening, right, and they didn't act, so I have to lock my dad down, because they didn't. Yeah, that's, if you like, lockdown with approval. We're consenting to it because we agree that you've left the elders, we need to protect them. But if they were to come 2 weeks after this virus had gone and attempt to lock down like that, they wouldn't have a chance. They wouldn't have it. That's what I believe. Sorry.
Yeah, I agree. And I think as well, it's kind of where mutual aid groups and community organising could be really great at the moment, because we haven't had a say in any of this. And a lot of us started isolating or doing other things before the government told us to do it, because we could see what was happening. So it's about communities seeing what's happening in their areas and making those decisions regardless of what the government says, because the government and the state, they aren't going to protect us and they're not going to protect our communities. Only we can do that by looking at what's out there and making those judgments. And I agree about, coming back to Attiq's point about unity and bringing people together. I think that's when we're at our strongest. And I think it's why the police have always set out to disrupt and pull apart groups that come together. So any organising that tries to get in different groups from all over the place are the groups that the police will target, and those individuals trying to do that the police will target, because they know that's where our strength is. And it's so important that we keep doing that and we keep bringing that unity back together. And the other positive thing I wanted to say about what's come out of this are events like this and going to things like this, especially for me. I live in Cornwall, and the amount of events I've been to that I wouldn't have been able to afford to get to in normal times, that I'm now being able to go to and engage in, I think is brilliant. And I think in terms of unity and connection, there's elements of that I think can really help moving forward as well.
Agreed.
I mean, I have to say the other thing that, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. And I think part of this is about people beginning to learn this lesson that we don't have to be waiting on the government to make decisions, that we can start to make decisions for ourselves. So, there have been a series of, partly because we have been restricted from the type of things that we, I guess, in some ways, from doing the same things that we've always done, the organising a march from A to B, or doing an action that's very poorly publicised, or whatever it might be. Much of the process of the last few weeks is about talking to each other. People have started to reimagine what a post-lockdown world might be, not simply in terms of the failures of the government, but what sort of systems we want in place to prevent this from ever happening again, that aren't just about criminalization, but are about taking the work that was done before about how you deal with a pandemic and ensuring that the resources are there to prevent it from happening again. Thinking about, if you're looking at potentially a recession with dramatic impacts on people's livelihoods, not repeating the same mistakes that were made in the aftermath of the banking crisis, and imposing a decade of austerity, but thinking about something else. I mean, I've always liked that quote, the one that says, we carry a new world here in our hearts. That world is growing this minute, right? So it's that idea, and what that means is this idea that we need to start thinking about what it is we want to happen next and talking to each other about how we make that happen. Because if we don't, exactly what's already been talked about the slippery nature of the government and the attempts to try and outsource a tracking app to Serco, who almost certainly balls it up, and giving another outsourcing company the training contract for local contract tracers without them having thought through exactly how they're going to do it. This is what they've always done, right? And I dispute. I mean, I loathe Boris Johnson. I'm sure that is a unanimous position among people that are here. Right? But it's not as though I can point to a period at some point in the past, certainly the recent past, where any government I can imagine would have been any better.
Necessarily. Yeah, I agree with that.
Absolutely. We need to be thinking about, okay, well, if this is a defining moment for all of us, then what is the world that we want that comes next, and how do we start to create that, right? And that is a political decision, and it involves the importance of campaigning, and it brings us back to sort of the core work the NetPol does, is that how do we protect people who decide to go out and seek that better world? Because the state is going to push back. They're going to be more repressive laws. They're going to try and use the coronavirus legislation and potentially new counter-terrorism powers and extremism powers to try and stop us from creating that new world. And we have to resist that. That's what human rights is about, defending people to go away and do other stuff, to go away and express their opinions and engage with each other. It's not anything more than that. It's a defensive mechanism. That's kind of all the work that we do. But the crucial thing is that we don't sit back and think we don't have any control over this. We've kind of slipped off into this. You did mention, Emily, about this contract tracing app.
Oh, I did, didn't I? Yeah, about ID cards through the back door.
Yeah, we haven't got long left. I just wanted to say this. The issue around surveillance is obviously, we live in a country where actually, and this is the one thing that I think is different from a number of other places, where there is a general acceptance that it's okay for us to be surveilled by the state, right? I mean, general as in widespread. There are more CCTV cameras in London than almost any other city in the world.
We love it.
If you poll people about counter-terrorism legislation when it's introduced, people are reasonably comfortable with it, right? As long as it doesn't affect them, of course. In a way so there isn't a kind of a solid instinct towards defending privacy in Britain. I don't think there is anyway. And that means, I think, with the contact tracing app that's being developed, I think there are genuine concerns that will lead to significant numbers of people downloading it simply on the basis that they will be told that it's going to be some way of protecting their health. And I do think that it's likely to be used for gathering vast amounts of information about all kinds of things, including people's mental welfare, their movement potentially, because that is what surveillance does. It gathers up as much information as it can and sifts in order to be able to find threats.
I'm holding my hands up. The day that it was announced that this app was going to contact and trace and control and ultimately eradicate COVID, I was out there saying, yes, this is great. I went on one of Glenn's posts and saying, why are people so scared? We're in a pandemic. We're dying. We've just got all these figures. They've literally just released these figures. We need this app, right? And I'm actually embarrassed that I was like waving this flag, the app flag, because I was so caught up in the numbers and in, Colonel Tom, who's now MB Tom.
Yeah. But I'd say don't be embarrassed, because we have to look at technology in terms of ways we can get out of this, but we have to look at the privacy aspects and who's behind it and how that can be used.
At no point I think that, I just wanted a solution. No, I just wanted this thing to end, and I know for a fact that so many people that I know personally kind of got drawn into the app is the answer. And yeah,
personally, sorry, Kev.
Let me just say this one thing, which is the irony about all of this and the debate about privacy in relation to this app is that most people, if you ask most people who are generally involved in public health and public health policy, they will say that the app is actually relatively minor. It's not really going to have as much impact on protecting people's health as the obvious things. The obvious things is testing. It's not happening at the moment, right? It's about community contact tracing, which is there's a network of people who are not Serco and not some dodgy outsourcing company, right? That exists already. They're called GPs. They know their patients. Where this could have been, we're in a position to be able to do that kind of thing. It doesn't involve any fancy technology or issues about whether Apple or Google are going to be able to do this. It's just that the governments, not just this government, but governments around the world, are kind of have latched on to the idea that technology will somehow speed up the process of getting people back into work and getting the economy back and moving again. When the reality is, if you look at pandemics in different parts of the world, particularly Ebola and other pandemics that have occurred, it's the simple things, which is testing, talking to people, gathering information about who they've been in contact with, that doesn't involve any fancy technology. It's just, it takes time. And what the government really wants to do is to get us back making money and buying stuff as quickly as we possibly can, which is the reason why we're talking about essentially a creepy surveillance app, which I'm very reluctant to download and stick on my phone, in all honesty.
Yeah, I'm not doing it.
I'm not having it on mine, mate. I'm not having it on mine, I'll tell you that now.
We're nearly out of time. Attiq, I wonder if you had some final thoughts or things to add.
My position on it is this, that whilst yes, there may in their eyes be a necessity for the app, the concern of course is that through the back door what they're doing is desensitizing people to the idea of being monitored, and then in the future it then opens the pathway for them to bring in other measures to monitor people more openly and more cheaply, because at the moment they can still monitor you. I mean, in the cases that we deal with, they use GPS cell sighting and all sorts of covert surveillance all the time on people, which you don't even realize and they've got access to. But at the moment, it's a very expensive and long-winded process for them to extract that information when they need it. Whereas if it's on an app or a digital ID card or something, they can monitor you more easily and cheaply. So I think that is all part of it. I mean, Prevent, for example, we watched a film called Minority Report back in the day and thought this is all sci-fi, but it's all becoming reality, So thinking long term, we have to be concerned and place our checks in place.
100% agree with that, Attiq.
Yeah, I mean, I just on one final point. I think Emily asked about whether there's a prediction of all things that might be coming that means that ID cards might be on the ground again, on the table again. I mean, it's impossible to say, but the government various governments have wanted to reintroduce identification cards at various times, and I imagine they would love to be able to do it again. But it's much easier if they can convince us to just hand over our information. So one of the crucial things about the way most police surveillance works, and this is certainly something that I know from the work that we do, it's not that the police are in there, kind of conducting the surveillance on us. It's that we hand over most of this information ourselves. We say where we've been. We share stuff on social media. And if the government can do it in a far, and the police can do it in a far simpler way, which is to get us to give up all that information, then that's what they'll do.
That's what I call the bind me massa strategy. Yeah, bind me tighter massa. And that they've been really successful at that. When fear's involved, when people are scared. Yeah. But just if I could just make one last contribution to this discussion, is that I trust government to be more concerned about power than they are about our safety. I trust them to do that. And it seems to be a natural inbuilt technique they've got that, you know, so when this, as far as I'm concerned, it's a sad day when people are saying trust in Orange and Apple, when Edward Snowden showed us, you know, there's what they say happens and then there's what actually happens. And I think people need to be really, really, really cautious about the whole idea of giving government apps which can track who you're with, when you're with, who you know what I mean, where you went. People say to me they've got phones already that can do that. They have, but not ones that can say I was with Brian, Sue, John, Attiq, and everybody at this time in this place. I think that in terms of being an oppressor, that's a gift for them.
Am I the only person that's logged on now that gets, maybe I am, because I you know, prior to all of this, like I said, I was very naive. Every month, Google email me a whereabouts log as to where I've been.
That's because they know you're in or out, man.
Yeah, you're supposed to switch it off in your settings. There's a hidden Google setting. You've got to switch it off.
Every month.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
They send me an email.
That's it. If you switch yours off.
Right.
Yeah, that's switched mine off as soon as I found out.
Last
Yeah, all
month,
mine are switched off.
I don't think you need to ask that question of me, Frank.
a disclaimer
No,
to
you
say, don't be alarmed. Your movements have gone down 90% because of COVID.
Kev, can you show Fiona where the switch off button is on that particular
After this
app,
is
please?
over. I'm sure we can issue a guide or something, you know what I mean?
I was going to say, maybe something comes of this. We're like, give us some tips for your phone's not tracking you.
Yeah. Emily, I think we're up on time now.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was great.
Thank you all.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much, guys. That was amazing. Thank you. See ya. Bye-bye.
That's it. Thank you, Kevin. Everybody, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Emily,
I'm going to go as well.
Thank you very much. Valuable stuff.